All right. Welcome, everyone, to this special event today. My name is Fred Dickinson, and I am the director of the Penn Center for East Asian Studies, and we're delighted to have an all-star cast of aficionados of foreign policy today talking about a very important event happening very soon. I would like first to express my deep condolences to the family of Dante Wright, the latest tragic victim of excessive state and civil violence against men and women of color in America, just 10 miles from where the trial over the killing of George Floyd is now taking place. We're gathered here today, of course, to discuss primarily a foreign policy matter, the upcoming US-Japan summit in Washington. But a state's diplomacy, of course, is only as good as its domestic political, economic, social, and cultural health. At this key global inflection point in both domestic political and global geopolitical affairs, we're very grateful to our four distinguished speakers for taking the time to share with us their thoughts on a vital bilateral relationship. Let me also extend my deep appreciation to the Japanese consulate in New York, with whom we've cooperated now on several exciting events, particularly to Deputy Consul General Kenju Murakami and Risa Shibuya, both of whom were very instrumental in bringing this illustrious panel together. Next, I'd like to thank our local partner, the Japan-America Society of Greater Philadelphia, and two of its key members, Honorary Consul General of Japan in Philadelphia, Mr. Dennis Morikawa, and former director of the JASGP, Kazumi Chuni, both of whom were very helpful in brainstorming at an early stage about the possible shape of this panel. Finally, I'd like to extend a heartfelt thank you to our co-sponsor, Perry Woldhouse, Penn's own powerhouse Center for the Study of International Policy, for its help in hosting and promoting this event, and especially to the intrepid assistant to Perry Woldhouse directors, Jasmine Wallach, for her very efficient and always good-humored help with the logistics of our webinar today. So we're here today to celebrate what might be described as Japan Week on the global stage, beginning with the gripping victory at the Masters tournament last Sunday by Japan's Hideki Matsuyama, and coming up to the Suga Biden summit to take place tomorrow in Washington, D.C. Our panelists today, I think, will be talking more about the Suga Biden summit than they will be talking about Matsuyama. But I mentioned both as a glimpse of an aspect of a Japan largely forgotten by American audiences. That is a Japan at the center of the global political, economic, geopolitical, and cultural stage. Since the collapse of Japan's asset price bubble in the early 1990s and precipitous rise of Chinese power, discussions of Japan in the United States have dramatically declined. But if we are paying attention, we have frequent glimpses of an enduring Japanese global centrality. Matsuyama is, of course, the first Japanese national and only second Asian male to win this first and most important tournament on the US PGA Tour. And Prime Minister Suga's visit to Washington, I think he's already arrived, makes him the first foreign leader to meet our new President Biden in the White House. Some American observers speak of Japan as a middle power, increasingly caught between the US and China, or the US and Russia, but as both Matsuyama's Masters win and Suga's Washington visit both suggest, Japan is more frequently a driver than a captive of international developments. And we've invited an all-star cast of commentators today to give us a sense of that Japanese agency. So let's now turn to our program. First, let me explain our agenda. The American media has already bombarded us with news of the summit from the perspective of Washington. So today we begin with two prominent Japanese voices. This will be followed by a response from two prominent voices from outside Japan. And then I'll moderate an open discussion among panelists. Finally, we should have about 15 minutes or so for panelists to respond to questions from the audience. A brief note to the audience on the mechanics, although we've reserved the chat function of this Zoom webinar for our panelists, audience members do have access to the question box, so feel free to begin sending in your questions as soon as you have them. I can't promise that we can get to all questions, but we'll try to accommodate as many as we can by the time we get down to the open discussion. Okay, so it is my great pleasure now to introduce to you our two distinguished interlocutors from Japan. First, we turn to Mr. Nomukatsu Kanehara, Senior Advisor to the Asia Group. Until 2012, Mr. Kanehara enjoyed a distinguished career with the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where he served, among other positions, as Deputy Chief of Mission in Seoul and Minister at the Embassy of Japan in Washington. From 2012 to 2019, he was Assistant Chief Cabinet Secretary to Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. And between 2013 and 2019, he worked as inaugural Deputy Secretary General of the National Security Secretariat. Although a brilliant diplomat and statesman, Mr. Kanehara is also an accomplished writer and history buff. In fact, I first had the honor of meeting Mr. Kanehara in March of 2018 when he invited me to lunch in Roppongi to discuss, of all things, my first book on Japan in the First World War. Needless to say, this was the first time any policymaker, either in the United States or Japan, expressed any interest in my obscure analysis of World War I. But of course, I took it as a side of the incredible vision in Tokyo. At any rate, Mr. Kanehara is the author of two very well-received books on Japanese diplomacy: the 2011 book, A Japanese Grand Strategy for the 21st Century, and just last year, Lessons of History, The Essence of Failure and National Strategy. And he just told me that he has two new books appearing in Japan this month, one on national security strategy and the other on national defense in the Reiwa era. Our second featured speaker from Japan is Ambassador Kanji Yamanoji, current Consul General of Japan in New York. Between his initial overseas posting at the Embassy of Japan in DC in 1997 and his current position in New York, Ambassador Yamanoji served as Director of the First Southeast Asia Division, Director of the First North American Division, and Deputy Director General for the Asian Affairs Bureau within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He was also Executive Assistant to two Prime Ministers, and in 2013 served as Minister for Economic Affairs at the Embassy of Japan in Washington. Needless to say, Ambassador Yamanoji is a longtime friend of the US, and you might also guess that he's quite an aficionado of American culture. If you haven't already seen it, please take a look at a popular YouTube video of the ambassador posted last July 2020. Incredibly, it shows the ambassador paying a July 4th tribute to the United States, especially to our medical professionals and essential workers. And this is the kicker, he's doing it with a Jimi Hendrix inspired rendition of the Star Spangled Banner on his Fender Stratocaster electric guitar. Needless to say, this YouTube video amassed some 260,000 views in the first week alone. And it is part of the ambassador's great talents that we hope to bring again to Philadelphia Live to see him and his band perform very soon. Let us now first hear from Mr. Kanehara, and then Mr. Kanehara will yield the floor to Ambassador Yamanoji. Please take it away.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you for having me. I was diplomats before joining Prime Minister's office, and I'm in the French School of Japanese Foreign Ministry. I'm a French speaker. When I learned in Paris, my teacher told me, Kanehara-san, in France, you have to always make 3 points. If you go beyond 3, you seem stupid. That's French teaching. And today I'm gonna make 4 points. I couldn't be French anyway. The point 1 is the liberal international order is now emerging in Asia. And we're at creation of liberal international order in Asia. Today's liberal order, international order, was created by the industrial precursors, Europeans, Americans, and lastly, Japanese. And when the Americans got independent in the 18th century, everybody was shocked. When the French killed their king, everybody was shocked. But after that, during the 19th century, liberalism with the institutions spreads. In Europe, and of course in the United States, Japan opened its parliaments in 1890. Japan wrote its Western-style constitution in 1889. We're in the same wave, the first wave of the liberalism worldwide. But in the 20th century, we had big wars and the communist revolutions, dictatorship in Germany, politicization of the military in Japan. We had the totalitarian trends, but we overcame it. And after the Cold War is over, the world became flat. But this is the path of precursors. Many Asians, together with the Africans, went through the very different path. They were colonized, racially discriminated, started in the 15th century by Spanish and Portuguese. It continued up to the 1950s. And they overcame this one by one. In 1950s, many Asian nations with the Africans, they got independence, but unfortunately, they turned to dictatorship because it was much more efficient to waste their thoughts for quick development. Human rights came later, but in 1990s, even in 1980s, the Asians turned to democracy one by one. The Philippines, 1986, Korea, 1987, and then ASEAN nations, maritime ones in particular, and Taiwan. They got independent proudly in 1990s. There are many flaws, of course, but we have to embrace them. They are no longer pupils of democracy. They are standing up as a new young democracies. Setbacks, of course, in Myanmar, and shaky political situation in Thailand. And these things, they will overcome one by one. We have to help them. And the second point is this liberal thinking is not alien to the Asians. Institutions were the invasions of the British parliamentarism and the balance of power, three powers sharpened by French thinkers and elections. These things came from the West. We very much appreciate that. But basic thinking is the same. Human dignity is the same, equal, regardless of skin color, sex. And this kind of thinking is very ancient in Asia. Mencius, the Confucian thinking, he said, the people is the most precious. State food is less precious, and the king is the least precious, he said. And the king who abuses his people loses the mandate of the heaven, and he can be decapitated, he said. Sounds like French in the 18th century, doesn't he? And this is not very much alien to us, and we can do share the universal values, the absolute equality of dignity, and the truth is in everybody's minds, not imposed by totalitarian rule, and the government is an only instrument. And there's no difference in this kind of thinking between the West and the East. And what we call in English love, truth, God, we're calling that the love, compassion, truth, Buddha, and Confucius. So we have to establish a true universal values here, and based upon that, we have to establish a liberal international order, expanding not only in US and Europe, but expanding to Asia. And then we have to be successful. Today's big challenge is, of course, China. China was with us when they tried to take back the small island in Siberia called Damansky. They crashed against Soviet forces and they got frightened suddenly. They jumped to Tokyo and Washington was in agony with Vietnam War. And normalization, Sino-American normalization happened in 1970s. We followed that very quickly, Tokyo and Beijing. Since then, China was on our side. And Mao's age was over. The extreme, cruel age, brutal age was over. And Hu Yaobao with Nakasone, he was talking about democracy of China. We believe that. And then the Tiananmen happens. It's only Japan stood by China. And even Emperor Akihito went to Tiananmen. And we believe that we could not send back the Chinese to the extreme age of Mao. We believe that then Deng Xiaoping could open the door. He opened the door economically, but he shut the door for democracy firmly. But we believe that the internet and the middle class and the free speech will change China and they will join us one day. And for the moment, at least, our expectation was betrayed. And China is now jumping out of this Western circle, and they are stepping into the shoes of the kingdom of the communists that Soviets held a long time. And this is no longer, there's no longer communist bloc, but China believes that something different from this liberal order can be carved out. They can have their own sphere of influence, at least in Asia. It's a very long path. Japanese thought in the same way, 1930s, kicking out all the white people, having our own sphere of influence, and Japan is the leader. But there was no values there. And we do share universal values today. The world is flat. There's no discrimination, no colonization. We are living in one single world where people can pursue his or her own happiness based upon his or her own conscience. So we have to prevent China from derailing from this path for liberalism. They don't share the joy of liberal version of world history. Why this happens, I wonder. We felt that in 2008, we felt something very different in China. So something is going on, and it must be because of the Lehman shock. The United States fell, Europe, Japan fell, and we asked China to pull the world economy, and they did. They powered huge amount of money in the public constructions, and they pulled the world economy. This is what Japan, West Germany did in 1970s after two series of oil shocks, and Japan and West Germany were welcome in the Rambouillet summit of G7. G7 was created for that, and Japan and Germany took back its world status. China did the same thing. G20 was made for China, and they were the hero. At that moment, China, something happened in their brain. Now this is Chinese century. The West is not falling. We have to take back China's ancient leading position. It is overconfidence, and this is against the progress of liberal international world history. And unfortunately, Chinese sense of nationalism is now coming in their brain and the imprinted by the education. And this China as concept is very new. There's no word like China in China. It's a series of dynasties, conquering dynasties. Some are Mongols, some are Manchus. The last millennium, half of the millennium, 500 centuries, 500 years, the China was conquered and ruled by Mongols and Manchus. China is a very international region, and sometimes hands take it back, sometimes northerns come down. That's this repetition is Chinese history. The last one was once a Qing dynasty, that is conquering dynasty. They brought in many minorities there surrounding China, Tibetans, Uyghurs, Mongolians, Manchus, and they made big China. And this is at the beginning of 20th century, and they fell. At that time, Chinese thoughts, we have to take back this China, not the hands of China, but this big China with many ethnic minorities. And Mao conquered everybody. This is something burning in their minds. What we lost at the end of the Qing dynasty, we have to take it back. That's the reason why they are driven towards expansion. And this is very bad. They still don't understand that. And they don't think the free will of the people is a determinant factor to decide who can rule this one region, the second region, third region. They're simply thinking we have to take back. That's happened in Hong Kong. Hong Kong's freedom was put to death suddenly. But this is the lost territory after the very dirty Opium War for the Chinese. We have to take it back. The free will of Hong Kongese don't care. That's what's happening there. And Xi Jinping is a particular leader. Hu Yaobao, as I said, he was talking about democracy with Nakasone in 1980s. Hu Yaobao was very different, but Xi Jinping is from the generation that destroyed Chinese intellectuals under the leadership of Mao in the Cultural Revolution. Red handkerchief here, the bogging down the professors in the ground of the schools. That generation do not feel any yearnings for liberalism. They believe that the regime is strong, resilient, and can take over one day the leadership from the West. And this is a very bad conviction. It takes time for them to change. Next one could be a very different, more international, speak English, learning a lot in the UK, US, and Japan. They could change China, but it takes 20 years. The third point is the fourth point is then what the strategy of ours. Can we engage China? By 2030, China will be bigger than the United States in the terms of economy. That means US will be, for the first time, number 2 in world economy. Amazing, isn't it? Their military budget is soaring. They're 4 times bigger than Japan. Our military budget is the same as the UK, France, and Germany. That means UK, France, Germany plus Japan's military budget is now smaller than China. And they can be a great threat militarily in the near future. But when US, Japan, UK, Europe, and India, and ASEAN nations are united, possibly with Korea, we are far bigger than China. That means China is only regional hegemon. They can never be a global hegemon. When the West is united, we can still engage China. And that depends upon very much Washington's leadership. Mr. Trump's China policy was harsh, but he had some point. But he lost many friends. Now Mr. Biden is now rehabilitating his alliances in Europe and in Asia. We still very much expect that he is going to lead the free world, in particular, the new international order in Asia. The FOIP is just for that. We free and open in the Pacific. The point is, it's not only Asia Pacific. Now we have to pay attention to the West Asia. We have to engage Indians, the future superpower. By 2035, they're expected to exceed the size of economy of Japan, and their average age of Indians is 10 years younger. Amazing, isn't it? 1.4 billion people. They are now 10 years younger than the Chinese. Chinese average age is 40 years old. Japanese 50, we feel very old. Indians average age is amazingly 29 years old. Africans 1 billion, 19 years old. The gravity of history is moving towards the West, but we have to engage them. And we have to expand and make solid this newly emerging liberal order in Asia. Quad is the basis of that. So when we talk about economic expansion and integration, regional economy and free world and values, everybody joins us in discussions. When Japan says, now we have to talk about strategy, military affairs, they go home. Unfortunately, this is the reality here. And only big ones remain. That's only Japan, US, and India, and Australia. We don't want to have an exclusive club here. We want to make a transparent, open, large community here. But so far, it's only Quad. We're happy to make this cinque or sextet or septet, even an orchestra. So we have to persuade Koreans, the Indonesians, and we have to invite UK, France, Germany, Brussels. But now this is the uphill works that we have to do. Meantime, Japan alone is now facing China with the United States. Australia is always with us, but they're in the southern hemisphere. And Korean leftist governments, their strategic direction is a bit confused. So this is the very difficult start points of liberal order in Asia, but the spine of this order is Japan-US alliance. Our responsibility is very big. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Kanehara. Ambassador, would you please share your remarks now? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. And thank you so much, Kanehara-san, with a big picture. I'm very much impressed. So I would like to focus on the upcoming leaders meeting between Prime Minister Suga and President Biden. As you just know, Prime Minister Suga is invited to White House as the first guest to the White House after his inauguration. This means a lot in many ways. But I would like to mention that this move is not coming out of blue. This is a very much well crafted and calculated move, diplomatic move. And so I just mentioned that the two sort of preludes or overture. If you remember, about a month ago, there was a first ever Quad leaders meeting online among Japan, US, India, and Australia, this Quad. It's a very significant move. And 4 days after, there was US-Japan foreign ministers meeting in Tokyo. That means the newly appointed Secretary of State of the United States chose Japan as the first destination to his foreign trip. And actually, not only the foreign ministers meeting, but we did 2+2 meeting among the foreign ministers and defense ministers. Then tomorrow, the first leaders meeting in person will be held in White House. And if we look back to history, say a couple of decades ago, traditionally, the first leaders who were invited to White House used to be the leaders from the United Kingdom or Canada or Mexico, because they are neighbors. But 12 years ago, when President Obama took the office, he chose Japan as the first sort of a nation to make a contact in foreign policy. Then Hillary Clinton chose Japan as the first destination to visit. And actually, Prime Minister Aso was invited to White House as the first leader officially invited to White House. And that was a sort of significant move. And actually, at that time, Obama administration mentioned Asia pivot policy to put Asian affairs the higher priority in the US foreign policy. And this year's move is sort of following these directions. But remember, this year is still under the shadow of COVID-19. So it's never easy to have the in-person meeting while President Biden is mentioning social distances and prevention of the infections. So this is a very, very important decision by the side of the United States and also for Japan. So I think that we should ask the right question to understand the significance and the connotations and the meaning of this upcoming leaders meeting. So first question is, why Japan? The United States has many partners and allied countries, but why Japan? Short answer is, in my opinion, Japan is the most trusted ally, the partner. Okay, the Japan is first most trusted and ally and partner among the United US friends with solid political will and resources. I would mention 4 elements of Japan. The first, Japan is the country who share the basic value like democracy, rule of law, and human rights and market economy. And not just sharing the value, but also US and Japan's been working so hard together to fulfill its goals. So that is very important moment, the element of the trust. And second element, second factor of the Japanese is its economic power. And actually, Japan is still the 3rd largest economy, following United States and China. And also the 10th populous country among the world. And there are so many strategic alliances between Japanese companies and the US companies, making a lot of profit and shaping sort of the way we live. And I just want to show one chart. That is the chart of the direct investment from foreign countries to the US. As you can see, this red line is Japan. So now Japan is the biggest investor to the United States. So the amount is about $6.2 billion and actually creating about 1 million direct jobs. If we include indirect or related jobs, that would be many millions. That is a part of the US, very important element of the US-Japan relations today. This economic alliance, this economic partnership means a lot. And third element is the partner of security affairs, security policies. The US-Japan security treaty was signed more than half century ago. And now in Japan, we do have 50,000 US soldiers and officers, and the biggest presence of the American forces outside of the United States. And Japan is the biggest provider of the host nation support. That means a lot. And also there are so many joint exercises and things like that. I will show you the one picture. This is a good picture of the working together. But I would mention this US-Japan alliance is not just on the paper. US-Japan security treaty is so important. Can you imagine that treaty is just one-page paper with 10 provisions, 10 articles. But this treaty means a lot and actually doing things. And this alliance is not just on the paper, not just on the desktop joint exercise. This is real world. So if you remember, 10 years ago, 2011, March 11, we were hit by triple disasters, earthquake and tsunamis and nuclear accident. And at that time, US forces helped us a lot. US-Japan alliance functioned in a very effective way. They rescued Japan as a country, and they rescued Japanese people. And Japanese people never forget that. And the fourth element of US-Japan relations in Japan is from the very top of the country, the prime minister, to government officials or business people, and the people in general. They just have mutual understanding, mutual trust, and mutual respect, and the friendships have been fostered for years. So if you see any kind of opinion polls or questionnaires, so in both Japan and the United States, this mutual respect and friendship is so high. So these elements makes Japan as the first country whose leader is invited to the White House. So to me, it's a very natural move. And the second question about the upcoming leaders meeting is this: what's going on in the world? Of course, leaders meeting itself means a lot, but probably it's almost impossible to understand the real significance of the meeting unless we do have the right perspective of what's going on in the world today. And the world is very different from 20 years ago. Just like Kanehara-san mentioned, the whole historic perspective, the things are changing. But today's world is so different from, say, 20 years ago, of course, 100 years ago. And so I would pick the four elements of this today's world. First is China. And China is growing. So 20 years ago, Chinese GDP was only $1.2 trillion, while Japan's GDP was almost 5 trillion, 4.5. The US GDP was $10.2 trillion. So Chinese GDP is about only 10% of the US. But 10 years later, 2010, the Chinese GDP became about $6 trillion, the same size of Japan. At that time, US GDP was $15 trillion. So it's about slightly less than 50%. But last year, US, we are missing the chart. Last year, the Japanese GDP was about the same, $5 trillion. Chinese GDP, according to the IMF, it's $14 trillion. In the US, it's $20 trillion. It is huge change. And it's quite natural for the enormous shift of the things, the power shift. And I would like to show the one chart showing this dramatic change. We are missing the chart. So this is very important one. If we see the defense spending of those three countries, it's amazing change. And in year 2000, the Chinese defense spending and Japanese defense spending is about the same according to the SIPRI, Stockholm International Peace Institute. But by 2010, the Chinese defense spending became like $144 billion, while Japan was $45 trillion. So this year, I'm sorry, 2020, the Chinese defense spending is about 266 trillion. Japanese defense spending is about 46. The US, 718. So that means the balance of power has been shifting so much. That means China have provided us with opportunities and also challenges and concerns. It is very interesting. Among this time, the United States sent Mr. John Kerry, former Secretary of State, as a special envoy to Beijing. And also, the US sent Mr. Armitage to Taiwan about this time. So it is clearly showing a kind of the opportunities and challenges. It's most likely the competition. And so if I remember the US-Japan foreign ministers meeting last month, they spent a lot of time to discuss about China. So including both of them oppose the Chinese trying to change existing status quo by force. Was they talked about the election system of Hong Kong, or they talked a lot about the South China Sea and East China Sea and Uyghur and economic security matters like the market distorting kind of the things, and also intellectual property rights. So this China is a big issue about what's going on in today's world. And the second element of the what's going on in the world is climate change. If I remember 20 years ago, year 2000, United Nations came up with the idea of Millennium Development Goals. They set the 8 goals among those climate about the international community's goals. So this environment and climate change is one of those. That's 1/8. Then year 2007, if you remember, former Vice President Al Gore released the book called Inconvenient Truth. There was a sort of a testimony of what's really going on this earth. It's a very, very convincing things. Then year 2015, the United Nations came up with new goals called SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. It includes 17 goals for the international communities. But out of 17, 7 were directly related to the environment and the climate change. The world is notion of the climate change is going up so much. So this is a very important element for today's world. And third element of the today's world, of course, COVID-19 or pandemic itself, because now we are enjoying the global economy and globalism. The world is so connected each other. So no single country cannot be isolated in a way of this disease or many other things. So it is so important to work together to address this pandemic, and it requires a lot of coordination. So this is COVID-19 is one thing. And fourth element of today's world is technology, high tech. And this can change a lot of things, both political issues and economic issues, businesses and societies' daily lives. So national security and privacy, it's all related to this high tech. So we have to understand we are living in this kind of world, Chinese rise and climate change and pandemic and technologies. So this is today's world. Then third question about tomorrow's leaders meeting is what should be discussed? Leaders meeting itself is so significant, but when I joined the foreign ministry about 30 years ago, and the issue of the two leaders meeting, most likely the bilateral issues. Bilateral issues means trade problems like rice, semiconductors, or supercomputers, or automobile parts. Those were the issues between two leaders. That was about 20, 30 years ago. But today, the two leaders have been discussing how US and Japan working together for the sake of the betterment of the world. Oh, now we come back with this chart. So, but if I may, I just want to show the chart of the defense spending of the US, Japan, China. And the big high line is the US, and this going up line is China, and the Japanese defense spending is about the flat. So this means a big change among the international community. Then go to the what should be discussed, question number 3. Then there used to be two leaders been discussing the bilateral relations and bilateral issues, but today, the US and Japan, how we can work together for the betterment of the world. That is today's things. And the interesting thing is, when US leader and Japanese leader meet, they are not just discussing these Asian affairs, or they are discussing almost all range of the foreign policies. So I'm sure that all the floors of the Japanese Foreign Ministry, or all the floors of the US State Department, are very busy for the preparation of this leaders summit. And actually, this is so significant leaders meeting. But I would mention 4 keywords for that. The first one is FOIP. Kanehara-san also mentioned this free and open Indo-Pacific. If you see this map, this is the area where there are so much opportunities and potentials and possibilities. But we can see a lot of source of the problems and issues and challenges and concerns. In this area, North Korea is there, East China Sea, South China Sea, and Hong Kong, or Myanmar, and also Middle East. So this is a very important area. And if this area can be secured in terms of the peace, stability, and prosperity, the world would be a much better place. So the two leaders will discuss how to make sure that in this area, Asia, Pacific, and the Indian Ocean, this area, be free and open, following the rule of law and market-oriented democracy and market-oriented economy and human rights. And they would discuss how to make sure that the international trading system be fair and open. And another topic or another keyword for tomorrow's leaders meeting would be COVID-19. And this COVID-19 is probably the most difficult and the most serious challenge that our world has been facing after the Second World War. And to tackle COVID-19, international coordination is inevitable. And two countries like US and Japan can take a lead for the international coordination, so that for that equal access to vaccine and other medical resources. And also, it's very important to meet its financial needs. So US and Japan be the two countries which should discuss this one. And actually, Japan is taking a lead, like a COVAX facility, so that the countries in need be supported in appropriate way. And third keyword for the leaders meeting would be global warming. And everybody knows President Biden is advocating the importance to address this global warming through the election date. And he laid out the set of the policy agendas. And also Prime Minister Suga, as you see today's Wall Street Journal, he wrote the thesis about the upcoming meetings. And this global warming is one of those very important ones. And actually, Prime Minister Suga mentioned in his policy speech, the climate change is a pressing global issues. And also he committed to make Japan the carbon neutral by 2050. And also he mentioned green growth strategy with offshore wind or hydrogen and other advanced technologies. So this global warming would be the one key element of the leaders meeting. And also the fourth one, the supply chains. And under the COVID-19, the people just realize risk and vulnerability of supply chains in many things, including the medical supplies, and also certain very important areas like semiconductors or batteries or essential minerals like rare earth. So this is a very important part. And actually this supply chain is so much connected to the high-tech software. So this supply chain is a part of the economic security. So, and this would be so something we need to discuss. So to sum up my presentation, I just want to mention the three things. And actually, a diplomat should not make a prediction because tomorrow never knows what's going to happen. But I dare mention three elements of the tomorrow's leaders meeting. The first one is tomorrow's meeting, most likely, or tomorrow's meeting, leaders meeting is expected to foster personal trust and chemistry and friendship between two leaders. It's a great opportunity for President Biden and Prime Minister Suga to know each other. One very interesting common thing is Mr. Biden is from a very small town called Stockton of Pennsylvania. And Prime Minister Suga is from Akita Prefecture. He is from the strawberry farms. So they have something in common, and I'm sure that they would know each other better, and they would force friendship between two would be fostered. And second, tomorrow's leaders meeting is expected to enhance US-Japan alliance, and not just security or defense, but also economic policies and the international communication, international corporations, because they would discuss in the wide range of the issues, bilateral issues, regional issues, and also global challenges. And tomorrow's leaders meeting is expected to shape and show the US-Japan leadership toward the world. And most likely they would issue the joint statement, which laid out the policy direction of the two countries and the world. And I'm sure that the world would paying a lot of attention to tomorrow's meeting. So I just hope tomorrow's meeting will produce the good outcome for the sake of the betterment of the world. Thank you very much. I will stop here.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And Mr. Kanehara, some very important common points from both of these. We get a very rich vision of the importance of China, clearly from the Japanese side, and from both of our speakers so far. We've got a very rich sense of a wide range of common interests and values that Japan, US, the world shares, and that will be showing up tomorrow in a very wide-ranging discussion. I think that part of the story is particularly striking for Americans. Let's now move on to the second part of our discussion, and we will be going now to get a glimpse of the view from the American side, or at least outside of Japan. And for that, we have two more distinguished speakers. First, I'm delighted to introduce Ambassador Susan M. Elliott, President and CEO of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy. Ambassador Elliott has a PhD from Indiana University, and before becoming a diplomat, taught at Ball State University in Indiana and at the University of Virginia. During her distinguished 27-year diplomatic career, she served in Belfast, Athens, Lima, and Moscow, and was civilian deputy and foreign policy advisor to the commander of the US European Command. She was also deputy assistant secretary of state in the Bureau of South and Central Asian Affairs, and from 2012 to 2015, ambassador to Tajikistan. Ambassador Elliott was Deputy Executive Secretary and Director of the Executive Secretariat staff for former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, and became President and CEO of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy in August of 2018. And I just learned Ambassador Elliott is from Pennsylvania, Doylestown. Her son went to Penn. And so I hope this is the first of many other appearances. Now that the secret is out of the bag, we'll have to invite her more and more. Let me now introduce Joshua W. Walker. He is our second respondent today and the current president and CEO of the Japan Society in New York. With a PhD in politics and public policy from Princeton University, Dr. Walker has held positions within the U.S. Departments of Commerce, State and Defense, and is professor of leadership and the American presidency at George Mason University and the Reagan Foundation. Following his work in the public sector, Dr. Walker served as CEO and president of the USA Pavilion of the 2017 World Expo in Astana, Kazakhstan, founding dean of the APCO Institute, Senior Vice President of Global Programs at APCO Worldwide, which is a leading global strategic communications firm, and Global Head of Strategic Initiatives and Japan in the Office of the President at the Eurasia Group, one of the world's leading political risk analysis firms. If I may so, however, I think the most impressive part of Dr. Walker's resume is one that I'm honored to share with him, and that is that we both grew up as missionary kids in Japan. So go missionary kids. At any rate, let's first hear from Ambassador Elliott, and then we'll hear from Dr. Walker. Thank you.
Well, yeah, I'm off of mute. Well, thank you very much, Professor, for that warm introduction. I'd also like to thank Ambassador Yamanoji, who is a very good friend and colleague of mine. We're both located, the National Committee on American Foreign Policy is located in New York, and we do a lot of coordination with our colleagues at the Japanese consulate here. I'd also like to thank my two fellow panelists, Kanehara-san and Dr. Walker. You know, they're both hard acts to follow, but I would like to say from the US perspective, I believe that the United States and Japan have a long shared and strong alliance and friendship for more than 6 decades. And that alliance continues today to endure and to grow, especially during the difficult times we've seen over the last year with the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic. The US-Japan alliance, in my opinion, is a cornerstone of peace, security, and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific region, and frankly, around the world. As Ambassador Yamanoji noted, Prime Minister Suga will be the first foreign leader to visit the White House since President Biden assumed office. I think this is really important, and the meeting underscores the high regard that the United States holds in its relationship with Japan. I think they also very well, the ambassador and Kanehara-san outlined our relationship is strong because of the vast list of mutual interests that we both share. Our enduring alliance is based on our ability to work together regionally and globally on a broad and far-reaching shared agenda. From the US perspective, we know we can rely on Japan to be a key regional leader in the Asia Pacific. I think one good example of this is Japan's leadership in the CPTPP. That's kind of a mouthful, but it's the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. When the United States withdrew from that important trade agreement, Japan assumed a leadership role and has really worked tirelessly to support and nurture that trade agreement. Japan has also strengthened regional connectivity through investments in several important infrastructure projects in many countries of the Indo-Pacific region. You know, the endurance of our alliance has allowed our relationship to grow, not only as Ambassador Yamanoji said, from economic interests and traditional to security concerns, but to tackling 21st century challenges that we both face. And those include, as he mentioned, climate change, looking for sources of clean energy, cybersecurity, space, information technology, the importance of developing supply chains, and of course, cooperation on the COVID-19 pandemic. And regarding the traditional security environment, I think one major sign of the continuity between the Trump and the Biden administrations is the inclusion of India and the Indian Ocean into strategic planning for the region. You know, the US now labels the region as the Indo-Pacific rather than the Asia-Pacific, and we have followed Japan's introduction of that term. So we followed their lead in broadening our perspective on the region. This is just one example of how I think US-Japan relations of the present are strengthening US-Japan relations of the future. Bringing that shared perception to strategic planning, I think will help deepen and broaden our cooperation in the region. Both US and Japan have a shared priority and interest in ensuring peace, prosperity in the Indo-Pacific. I think another area that was mentioned by Ambassador Yamanoji is the developing the capacity of the Quad. And the Quad is the US, Japan, Australia, and India. This group of countries share a lot of common interest. And I think tomorrow's summit comes soon after, I don't think I know, but it's come soon after the first ever leader level meeting of the Quad. During the meeting of the 4 Quad leaders, they announced partnerships to jointly tackle vaccine distribution, climate change, and critical and emerging technologies. This affirmative Quad agenda, I think, is a good signal to the region that multilateral cooperation is the key to helping provide public goods to all. It's also more important now than ever to continue the process of bolstering not only our bilateral relationship, but networking US allies together across the region. The Quad is one important forum, but the Biden administration has also stressed the importance of trilateral cooperation among the US, Japan, and the Republic of Korea. And again, at the recent meeting, I think the first overseas meetings that our secretaries of defense and state had were the 2+2 meetings that they had in Tokyo and Seoul. So this is another really important example that the Biden administration is very keen to strengthen and develop our alliances in the region. I think the US also sees the need for shared security environment between Tokyo and Seoul, even while recognizing that sometimes there are differences in the bilateral relationship between Japan and the Republic of Korea. But we also know that that is something that I think that the 3 of us can work through together. The US and Japan are also strengthening cooperation on capacity building in programs in Southeast Asia. Our shared national interest in the region are to help assist those states to resolve their disputes through dialogue, not force or coercion. So whether it's Coast Guard training or digital infrastructure development, or working together on issues related to COVID recovery, the US and Japan, I think, can play an important role in helping the smaller countries of the region maintain their ability to make autonomous choices. So as you can see, we have a strong and important relationship with Japan, which includes robust, not only bilateral, but multilateral cooperation on these many important issues. So I think I'll stop there so we have time for questions, but thanks again for allowing me to give my perspective.
Thank you so much. More very rich discussion of multilateral cooperation. Dr. Walker, please.
Let me jump in. As Susan said, it's hard to follow the act we've had. So I'm really excited about bringing everyone to have a conversation here. Given that I'm no longer a diplomat and I'm kind of at an organization where I can kind of throw out some independent observations, let me not just retread territory that the amazing speakers have given, and also just to give a shout out to both Kanehara-san and Yamanoji-san, who go far over and beyond. I think, you know, we had 2 very different presentations that were very complementary. I thought Kanehara-san's large view of history, going back into the historical understanding of the Middle Kingdom and the kind of imperial view of the world that China has, is particularly important in this moment, because I think what we're going to see tomorrow, as Yamanoji-san laid out, is very interesting in terms of competing narratives. Going into the summit, there's been a lot of hype and a lot of pressure, it seems, in Japan. What are the Americans going to ask from the prime minister on Taiwan, on China, all these things? Whereas I think from the American audience side, it's more a fascination with, okay, it's interesting that Japan is the first country to visit. Why is that? Why isn't it the traditional Canadian or Mexican or UK leaders? I think all of these things have aligned, as Yamanouchi-san said, that go back not just to the predecessors, but many generations before. The foundations of this relationship have been set a long time ago, 75 years ago, in fact, after World War II. The question now is, what will the world look like 75 years from now? Is this the beginning of the end of the American moment in some ways? And I think in some ways, as the US-Japan relationship goes, as that alliance continues, will determine our future as a nation. But at this very moment, most Americans are not paying as much attention to what's happening tomorrow as our Japanese colleagues are. To Japanese, this is an incredibly big deal. It's going to be wall-to-wall coverage every day. They're going to analyze every aspect of this visit. You know, how did Suga look as he walked in? Did he get a lunch? Did he get a dinner? Did he look tired? Did he look, you know, I mean, it's going to be a level of analysis that gets on the border of ridiculousness. Whereas on the American side, it's going to be 5 minutes on the evening news with a picture of Suga walking in, you know, a great visit. And I think that Ambassador Yamanouchi gave some great insights in terms of the characters of these two leaders. They've been a part of the political world for close to half a century in each areas. And in some ways, the imprint of Joe Biden and the imprint of Suga are on their political parties, the Democratic Party and the LDP of Japan. And so in some ways, they're both the caretakers of their nation and of the legacy of our relationship, but also they are going to be major players in what comes next, the next set of relationships. And so I think looking at how this relationship can go beyond the leader level, I think when you looked right before them, they were much more dynamic personalities in terms of President Trump and Prime Minister Abe. Certainly the so-called bromance and the Gulf diplomacy that was so ubiquitous during that period, it may be a little bit more boring. It may be a little more process driven. And I think it'll be a little bit more guided by our diplomats and not as much by family structures. But I think in some ways, this is all for the best. And I think what's interesting to watch here when we think about the free and open Indo-Pacific is our Japanese colleagues are too polite to take full credit for this, but it really is Prime Minister Abe's vision back in 2007, laying out this vision of a world. And so the question is, with this new Quad formulation that has been energetically and enthusiastically embraced by the American side, and as the Biden administration tries to struggle with a very divided America that seems to be struggling on the global stage, and as Japan gets set to host the world for the Olympics, what does this all mean? Our interests have never been more aligned, but a lot of it is not just the external environment that has forced us to this moment, including the role of an aggressive China, rogue states from North Korea to Iran. What is Russia doing in the world? Japan, in some ways, as the third largest economy, has a lot more at stake and a lot more that it could do, not just in terms of the military budgets that we saw that have flatlined, but the private sector. If you're going to have the major infrastructure project that's going to define this presidency, you're going to have to get private sector involved. When you think about train travel between New York and DC, in Japan, that could take 45 minutes. In this country, it takes 3.5 hours on our fast train, Excella, which even in third world countries are not quite, still have better train systems. And China certainly has beat us when it comes to infrastructure. So I think this is a generational opportunity before us. I'm obviously optimistic. I think there's a lot there, but I think it's also incumbent upon the leaders themselves to acknowledge that this relationship can't thrive with just two leaders and about personalities. It has to be an all of country approach. I think Americans are going through a unique moment where we find a lot of things about Japan appealing in a world that seems so chaotic and in instability. There's an island of stability like Japan, where things like Zen meditation, things like the tea ceremony, things like minimalism have emerged and seem to give us answers, ancient wisdom that apply to the modern era. So for me, I think listening to these excellent presentations, the question becomes, how do we get more Americans engaged in this? And then how do we get more Japanese to be engaged in terms of coming to study? When I look at the numbers of exchange students from China and Korea and other parts around Asia, it's going one direction, and from Japan, it's going another direction. And obviously, Japan's demographic issues in terms of its population rate means that Japan, in some ways, can be an early experiment for the entire world of an aging population. And when you think about how Japan has, in some ways, less dynamic politics because there's a more ordered, consensus-driven, harmonious democracy, that could actually be a good thing as we're going through, as we've seen on January 6th, as we see the divisions within our country, as you started the presentation about the once again another Black man being killed in this country. I think these divisions are things that when you see from the outside are deeply troubling. And I think Japan has some areas that we could learn from ourselves. And the historic relationship of America as the big brother and Japan as a little brother, those days are gone because we need each other more than ever. American foreign policy cannot thrive without our allies, without the force multipliers that they represent, as our secretaries of defense and state have represented. So I'm hopeful tomorrow. I think there's going to be some concrete things that come out of it, but I think like anything, it's only the beginning of a much longer journey. So with that, let's turn it to the broader panel. I'd love to engage in the conversation. I just want to thank you for hosting us here at UPenn, and obviously to my distinguished panelists, the opportunity to respond to their excellent thoughts and be able to further the conversation, hopefully with a little bit of provocative nature, so we can have a great conversation back and forth.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Walker. It's very appropriate for Japan Society head to talk about civil society connections, to talk about, again, another different perspective on the very broad relations that all of our speakers have been sort of discussing today. So this is our open session. I guess rather than trying to take over, I would just say if you could all, I see everyone now, good. Mr. Hanehara and Ambassador Yamanoji, if you have any just immediate reactions to Ambassador Elliott and or to Dr. Walker, I'll let you say something right now. Otherwise, I will just dragoon the discussion. So go ahead if you have any immediate reaction. Please just put on your audio. Yes.
I can't agree more. Thank you very much for excellent comments. Happy to take any questions from the floor.
Okay. Ambassador Yamanoji.
I just want to respond to the Susan. You just mentioned the Quad, and this is a very, very important undertakings among the U.S., Japan, and other two countries. And I remember when I was a director of the first North America division, I had a chance to participate in the trilateral among U.S., Japan, and Australia. I was a vice minister's level. And I have Nick Burns was the undersecretary at that time. And it was very significant meeting and with a strategic views and foreseeing the future. Then the basic idea already was, we want to talk with India at that time. But India was so cautious to participate this trilateral. They were almost opposing the other Quad because it looks like they're containing China kind of thing. So India had a different views on at least about 10 years ago. So it was only 2017 when the Quad, the director general's level meeting started. And it grew up to this point among the leaders meeting. So in a sense, this represents a change of this part of the world. And I think this is the right direction. And Susan, you are right. And Joshua, you are right. Because we need more coordination among the like-minded countries, or partners, or alliances. And this is the right direction, I really think. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would just add on that on the Quad, I think that, many people may think the Quad is 4 countries looking for ways that they can deter China. While China is a big player in the region and we need to discuss the rise of China, on the other hand, what I noticed, because my organization, National Committee on American Foreign Policy, holds track 2 discussions. So we get experts and scholars from the 4 countries of the Quad. And what I think was resonated with me was that they looked at things of common interest that were for the public good, you know, in terms of distributing vaccines and looking at other kinds of things, security related, that are of extreme importance to all of our like-minded countries.
Thank you. That's very interesting that you say that. There's some of the questions are actually, in fact, asking, okay, so you got the Quad, you got the FOIP. Clearly, this is just to contain China, right? But from what you're saying, it's much broader than that. Let me go ahead if you.
Well, I would just say, you know, I would agree that it doesn't mean that, you know, China wouldn't be discussed, but I think it's much broader than that. And, you know, I think the stronger that democracies are, and the United States is, you know, that we can have then better relations, I think, with China if we work and are stronger, you know, together. So it doesn't mean that they didn't discuss China. I'm sure that the leaders did, but that to me isn't the purpose of the Quad.
Great. So another question, since we don't have that much time left, I'm just going to sort of channel some of the questions that are coming up and related, in fact, to some of our respondents' questions or comments. And this first one has to do with what Josh was mentioning in terms of, yes, we have competing narratives, right? And the competing narratives sort of suggest that, and we have some pushback in the audience about there's so many of you up here today are talking about shared interests, but some are wondering, okay, well, what about the specifics in terms of tomorrow's summit? What is Japan going to say about Myanmar? Number one, what is Japan going to say about Xinjiang? What is Japan going to say about Taiwan, if anything? In other words, there are sort of issues that are there in which clearly, despite the shared values, there's certainly a different sort of strategy. And I wonder if any of you could speak to that.
Can I jump out real quickly just to throw this out, because it's always one of those difficult things. It's easy to kind of point out the differences, and I think those are excellent points. I think there is clearly a different Japanese perspective, and I think actually Kanehara-san laid this out from the historical view of how Japan deals with China. It has a long history of understanding that its position vis-a-vis China is best done in private, and going out in public and attacking China for its human rights record, calling it what's happening in Xinjiang a genocide, boycotting the Olympics, is not in Japan's own self-interest. Whereas on the US side, there is clearly a position that's being taken that says this is aligning because we have to do something. We need to draw a red line. For the last 50 years since the China opening in 1972, which you have to remember, 50 years ago, America in some ways changed the world order for Japan. Like up until that moment in time, China had been on a very different path. And when the US made a strategic calculation that to win the Cold War, they needed to split the Soviet Union and China, Japan was in a different position, and Japan had to figure out how to hedge itself more. And so I think that when it comes to Japan's role in the world on human rights, it doesn't operate as a military power or a superpower. So I agree that there are some key things to watch, but I can assure you, having talked to many of them, and the diplomats are here today, there's a lot of behind the scenes coordination on all of these, so that, you know, the 2+2 statement, which included Taiwan for the first time, has already been put out there. So whether or not it's uttered, which I imagine it will be because it aligns with their interest, there's a lot there. And I actually think that if the US and Japan talk the same way, it would be kind of inauthentic. It's actually more effective to have the Japanese with their approach, taking a more economic approach to things, and America taking a more moralistic approach. And I think increasingly, we, America, are going to be imitating the Japanese more than the Japanese will be imitating us. But that's just my personal view.
Great, thanks. Anyone else?
Well, I would just say that, and again, I don't have any insight because I don't work for the U.S. government anymore into what is going to be said. But, you know, we follow and we have cross-strait dialogue between mainland China and Taiwan. And I have seen press reports that, you know, there will be some kind of, there'll definitely be discussion on Taiwan, and there could be some kind of statement. But I agree with Josh that I think it's good to have differing, you know, we have common values, but, you know, to have differing points of view and take different approaches, I think is one of the strengths of the US-Japan relationship.
Can I?
Kanehara-san.
Yeah, as for Taiwan, it's I have to say that's the Taiwan is a truly threat. This issue is now coming very quickly to the Japanese media. So Taiwan was a taboo because China was our friends to face Russians for a long time, but now, amazingly, you know, every morning show or evening show, the comedians and everybody's talking about Taiwan today. Taiwan contingency. The big change happened in Japan this year. It's simply because the Xi Jinping's diplomacy has big stick diplomacy and put ends to the Hong Kong freedom and the maritime expansionist policy, and that's alarming Japanese people. Now we have to be serious about Taiwan because not today, but 10 years later, when China is on par with the American economic size and the military is now building up very quickly, it's no longer impossible. And they don't fight a war, losing a war, because that's the end of the communist regime. But if they believe they can do it, they will do it. She's determined to take back what they lost at the end of the Qing dynasty. And if they believe that they can do it in 2 weeks' time before American coming back, they will do it. They will have to say that our southernmost islands of Okinawan Islands are very close to Taiwan. Yonaguni is far closer to Taiwan than the Okinawan mainland. Okinawan, the biggest Okinawan islands. And that means Japan will be directly involved. Chinese jet fighters, 3,000 kilometers per hour, they can't move in this way. So we're directly involved. So we have to deter. But anyway, the contingency over Taiwan Straits, it's natural that we talk to each other. We don't help Taiwanese militarily. Americans are selling weapons to Taiwan. And both of us, Japan and the United States, have big interests, economic interests in China. The Boeing is selling the planes, and the Fords and Tesla are making cars, and Apple is making iPhones in China. So we have to realign our policies again. This is just a beginning, and supply chain is now discussed among the Westerners. So this is a moment of coordinating policies. National policy is different, but we have to coordinate, and then we have to be resilient. And this challenge of China will continue 20 years. And then they will pick out like Japanese, Indians coming up. US amazingly continues to rise in this way. So the coming 20 years are most difficult time for us. And the biggest issue is the deterrence of Taiwan contingency. Myanmar, Xinjiang, we cannot concede in principle. Anyway, abuse of human rights there, it's brutal. And we can't accept that. We have to say that. And showing displeasure is necessary, but we have to make a balance of many interests, economic interests and the military interests, and stability and human rights. And we have to do utmost efforts on human rights front, so we have to coordinate. I have said Asians are quite sensitive to double standard. Because Westerners, they show displeasure to China, but they continue business and they wish to engage Beijing anyway. And very often, middle-sized small nations are kicked around by the Westerners. You're a bad boy. And they punish these small nations and forget. And very often these small nations governments go to China. Because China extends their hands to welcome them, to welcome to this dictatorship world. We can't do that. If we show our displeasure and sometimes punish them with its sanctions, then we have to continue to engage them, change. And democratization cannot be done overnight. It takes centuries. It takes decades. But we have to continue to engage them. We have to continue to tell them this is not the right path. And so the punishment, displeasure, but with engagement. And we have to do the same thing to China and Myanmar. Okay.
That's very interesting. Thank you. Ambassador Yamanoji, did you want to address that? No.
Yeah, I just want to mention that tomorrow, the joint press conference will be scheduled. So as everybody knows, in foreign policy, and we can discuss freely inside. But sometimes we have to be very careful to make public statement because the public statement itself is a part of the whole game in a complicated world. So, so I would suggest that tomorrow, the two leaders will use what kind of words to describe this complicated world, how to cooperate with each other, how to address the very complicated and very sensitive issues. That would be very, very interesting. I just want to mention that one.
Great, thank you. And another sort of comment was that related to Russia and recent American sort of sanctions on Russia and sort of skepticism that the Japanese would do the same. And well, whether or not they do, I get the sense that you would say, okay, well, there are certain ways of doing things. And even if the Japanese don't sign at the dotted line on that, there are other means in which they can take to deal with cybersecurity issues or security issues vis-a-vis Russia. Anyway, I just wanted to move on to another question coming from the floor that sort of is very directly related to why we're meeting now, and it has to do with Suga versus Abe. I sort of get the impression that you would all say that what really, and Josh sort of articulated this, it doesn't necessarily all depend upon who's at the top, and I absolutely agree. I guess the question would be, though, what do any or all of you see as the one principal difference between a Suga approach to U.S.-Japan relations and an Abe approach? Clearly, they're very, very similar, but especially Kanehara-san, who worked very closely with both Abe and Mr. Suga, I'd be very interested to hear, what do you think in terms of the difference in if it's just style, if it's something else, what is it?
The strategy-wise, it's the same thing, because the Suga-san served as Chief Cabinet Secretary, that is the coordinating minister of agencies, for 8 years. And he was every time in NSC principals meeting, and he knows everything. So policy-wise, strategy-wise, it's the same thing. He's stepping into Abe-san's shoes. And Abe's strategy diplomacy was exceptionally successful. There's no reason to change that. If he's an opposition leader, he has to change. Anything but Abe must be the case. But everything Abe is okay. That's Suga's diplomacy. So he will continue. One big difference is the Washington. Washington is very different. Abe-san was the only one leader who could be in good terms with President Trump. Amazing, isn't it? He's far closer than the American institutions. State was very angry and don't do that. They were saying that to us, but we couldn't do that neither. It's only Abe-san who could take a phone and call President Trump, talk directly to him. They are truly close to each other, and this is exceptional. This will never be happening again. Then we have to coordinate among institutions, NSC, State Pentagon, CIA, and Commerce, the same counterparts in Tokyo. We have to coordinate closely, and going to the White House, Prime Minister's office, and we have to engage other allies like Europeans and Koreans. So I think the strategy-wise is the same thing, but the methods are going back to, say, normalcy, and we have to go back to traditional coordinating style.
If I could jump in real quickly, I think it's also, I agree with everything that Kanehara-san just said. One of the other things is the world has dramatically changed. We're now, because of COVID, globalization is under attack. Like literally, we can't travel to certain places in the world, and all politics is local, and never more so than now. And so actually, in some ways, Suga represents that pretty well. I mean, I think as Ambassador Yamanoji pointed out, here's a strawberry farmer from Akita, right? And here's a guy from Scranton that's lived his whole career as the youngest senator to become the president, kind of one of the most unlikely presidents that we ever would have had. None of us would have predicted 2 years ago that this would be the outcome. But precisely because of this moment of COVID, it seems that these two leaders find themselves. And when I look at Japanese and American history, there is that leader to leader area. And there's kind of it seems to me a myth that Republican leaders are better for Japan, you know, Nakasone and Reagan, kind of Koizumi and Bush. And, you know, a lot of people pointed out that Obama and Abe didn't seem to get along on a personal level, but I would point out that they got to Pearl Harbor together. They went to Hiroshima together. Like in some ways, this relationship has now grown beyond our leaders. And in some ways, Suga's agenda for Japan of regional revitalization and all these ideas related to cybersecurity in terms of Japan's readiness to deal with its own environment and deal with the Indo-Pacific, deal with China, is kind of a coming of age story. So in some ways, I can completely understand Japanese diplomats who might be trying to figure out, can they have as much of a preferential treatment as Trump gave to Abe? But I think in some ways, it's okay to go back to normal in the same way that our politics is driven by kind of the agenda, not necessarily in Washington, but what's happening in Minneapolis right now, what's going on in other parts of the country, in Texas and California, the reopenings or not openings, these type of things as well. So I just think the external environment is critical. Also, the internal domestic environment that COVID has completely reshaped. It's a different game.
I'd just add too that while I think it was extremely important, the relationship that President Trump and Prime Minister Abe had, I think the policies of the previous administration to look at, maybe not strengthening multilateral and being so involved in alliances outside of the U.S. We had the America First policy. I think that gave Japan an opportunity, even though there was a good relationship between our two leaders, but it gave Japan, as I mentioned in my remarks, the opportunity to assume leadership roles that perhaps they may not have done if we hadn't sort of retreated a little bit from the region. So now that, as President Biden said, we're back, I think while the relationship between the two leaders may be a little bit different, I think, the opportunities for others, having worked at the State Department for 27 years, I was very glad to see that, that our Secretary of State and our Secretary of Defense, their first trip overseas were to the region. So I think I agree with Josh, it's a different world, and I think that Japan has shown that they're up to being, maybe perhaps sometimes, as I think one of the speakers mentioned, that Japan in the past has been seen as a middle country, but I think Japan is emerging as more than a middle country and someone who's extremely important for the region and an important relationship for the United States of America.
Definitely. We're sort of getting close to time, but I do want to ask just one more of all of you. And this is also riffing off of one of the questions in the chat box that I thought was very interesting. And it does relate to what a sort of a brief line that Josh had earlier about the US-Japan alliance 75 years from now. What do you guys think the US-Japan alliance looks like 50 or 75 years from now? What is that? Is there such an alliance? Or is it something very different?
I'm an optimistic man, so my view is very optimistic. But China is now a big problem now, but they'll pick out. To other big powers are rising too, like India, and we can rebalance again this strategic picture. Today, China is suddenly very big, and everybody is not panicking, but we can take back the stability again, because China will lose steam. And meantime, I believe that Chinese are very smart people, and this kind of brutal dictatorship and digital surveillance, I can't believe that they can be patient with that for a century. And when the economy starts to slow down, they have many weaknesses inside. The ethnic minorities like Inner Mongolians, Tibetans, and the Uyghurs, even Taiwanese are saying that we are Taiwanese, not Chinese. This is a big threat to China, but I have to say, communists failed to produce identity. Soviet Union broke up. Yugoslavia broke up. And the Americans have succeeded in creating an American identity. Everybody swore the allegiance to the Stars and Stripes, and they weep for the national hymn in the American football, right? This never happened with Soviets and Yugos, and this can never happen in China neither. They have great difficulties inside. And we don't exploit that, but we have to wait until they get matured. And this will happen. So in the latter half of this century, the liberal order will be completed in East Asia. And that's and for the meantime, Japan, US alliance, the spine. And Korea will change too. It's a very leftist generation today. They feel sympathy towards North Koreans. Amazing, isn't it? But they will change too. So East Asia will turn into an important piece of world international liberal order. Then we have to engage Indians. Indians will be naughty, very much so. They are still small now today. When they're bigger than Japanese, they will not listen to Japanese. I'm quite sure for that. But we have to engage Indians, and Africa will come up at the latter half of the century. It's African century. They're 19 years old. In average, amazing, isn't it? 1 billion people. Now we have to create this. And we have to locomote. We're aiding only US, big different dynamics with migrants. 1 million people come rushing into United States every year, still amazing. But US is a locomotive, and this century is still the US century. And aiding Europeans, Japanese must help. And we could engage youngsters, young democracies jumping off to this scene one by one. That's my future vision.
Thank you. Ambassador Yamanoji?
Some people say history will repeat itself, but sometimes the history is not just repeating itself, it's evolving. So when the war ended, 1945, who believed 25 years later, Japan, who was destroyed almost everything, became the second largest economy of the world. So it's very difficult to make prediction for the 75 years from today. But I would like to mention that the say Cold War in 20th century and today's competition, if we compare, it's very different. One element is economic interdependence. The competition between Soviet Union and the United States was only strategy, no economic interdependence. That shapes the game rule of games. But today, US and China, it's competing with the enormous economic interdependence. That would shape the way we live in the world, and all the globalism is prevailing. So I'm not quite sure how the size of the Japanese economy or Japanese population 75 years from today. But I think this alliance and this relationship between US and Japan based upon the basic value and economic interest and strategic interest most likely will continue and to shape the way we live today and for the betterment of the world. That's what I think.
Thank you.
I would just, add to that, build on what the ambassador just said. I think that, we're stronger together. A colleague of mine, Ryan Haas, just wrote a book, Stronger, and it's about the US-China relationship, but it's focusing on, rather than focusing on fighting on the differences, is that we need to work on making ourselves stronger. And I think the US and Japan and others in the region can't be strong alone. We're stronger together. So I think strengthening our alliances, and as the ambassador just pointed out, who would have envisioned, after World War II, when we were adversaries, that we would now be such close allies. So I would envision, I'm very optimistic too, as Kanehara-san is, and I envision that we will continue to be strong, and our shared common values and interests will help us to maintain that strength.
Thanks, Josh. I get the impression that you're among the four, you're the one a little bit more skeptical about the sort of organic development of a globalized world with the US and Japan at the center. Is that right?
Yeah, no, what's funny about this is I hope the vision is what I've just heard. I guess what I think about is this. I hope that in 75 years, there is no US-Japan alliance. And what I mean by that is that we are so successful that there's no need for this. 60 years ago, President Kennedy gave the moonshot address when America was losing the space race to the Soviet Union and inspired America to look to the moon. Today, the two closest allies when it comes to space are the US and Japan, JAXA and NASA. Right now in space, there are 3 Americans and a Japanese astronaut that are orbiting the International Space Station. So I'm hoping that in 75 years time, the world will be so dramatically different that the fight that we are currently undergoing about resources on this planet become one that are much larger, where we realize that we actually do have a lot more in common here than we do, so we can look towards the stars to a vision that is very different. So I know that sounds a little bit utopian, but that's probably why I look in that vision, because I think 75 years is such a long period of time.
That's encouraging in a way and sort of frightening in another. It's like you're saying we have to get off the planet in order for this globalized vision to materialize. But yeah, no, I mean, I do want to thank Go ahead.
You only ask the questions. I just want to hear your view on your last question.
Oh, my view?
Yeah.
I'm just a historian, Ambassador Yamanoji. I loved your line about diplomats not predicting the future. I became a historian, so I wouldn't have to predict the future. But I will, if you insist, I will just share one thing, and that is, I agree with every one of you. What you say about the U.S.-Japan alliance today. I think it's even more central and even stronger than you make it out to be. And I say that because, my era of expertise is 1910s and 20s. And what I see in the U.S.-Japan relationship is something that most historians of Japan do not see. And that is a serious integration of politics, economy, geopolitics already in the 1920s. And exactly what Ambassador Elliott said before about how the Japanese have been sort of jumping into the breach of the sort of Trumpian sort of go it alone thing. The Japanese did exactly, they had practice. They did exactly the same thing in the 1920s. The Americans, okay, they created the League of Nations, but what, were they part of it? No, they were not. The Japanese were a very important sort of central player in the League of Nations system. And that's exactly why it was such a shock when the Japanese decided to go some other way. So I'm not gonna say, so I guess I want to leave it at that. I don't want to say that we have a mirrored situation because we know what happens in the 1930s. I'll just say, end on a positive note to say that it seems to me the centrality of the U.S.-Japan relationship in terms of global affairs is even more stronger than any of us think because of the past, more than 70 years, because of the sort of integration, political, economic, social, cultural that goes at least as far back as the First World War in the 1920s. Anyway, I'm not here to give the last word. I'm very sorry, but you asked for it. Anyway, thank you so much, panelists. It was such a pleasure to have you, at least virtually, at the University of Pennsylvania. I hope next time we can have you all together in one room at Penn itself. And I want Ambassador Yamanoji to promise to bring his guitar because he's promised several times to come to Philadelphia to the Sakura Matsuri and play. He hasn't been able to do that yet, but that's going to be one of our pleasures in the post-COVID world. I hope you will all join me in listening to him on his guitar when he comes. But again, thank you so much to all of you. It was a pleasure to speak with you about this very important event and to accentuate the idea that this really is an event that should get more, and I think this is what Josh was sort of indicating, should get more than 5 minutes on the nightly news tomorrow in Nora O'Donnell. Let's try to see if it does. If it does, then we've done our job. Anyway, thank you so much, panelists, and I hope to see you again very soon. Thank you, audience, for all of your questions. Wonderful questions. Sorry I couldn't get to all of them, but we'll do it next time. Thank you.
Thanks.
Take care.
ありがとう。
Thank you. ありがとうございました。お疲れ様でした。
お世話になりました。お疲れ様です。失礼します。どうも。